All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Knocking at the College Door webinar about high school graduates data and implications for the Midwest region. My name is Peace Brandsberger at the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education and co-author of the Knocking at the College Door report. I am your moderator today, and I am joined by two respondents who will provide insight about the implications of these trends in the Midwest states. Before we get started, I and my colleagues at WICHE would like to thank ACT and the College Board for their generous financial support of the Knocking at the College Door report and projections. Without their partnership and collaboration, these projections would not be possible. I would also like to thank the Midwestern Higher Education Compact for collaborating on this webinar. First, there is a little housekeeping information. All attendees will be muted. However, you should be able to hear at this point. If you cannot, please submit type something into the question box and we will attempt to assist you. You can click on the small orange box on the right of the screen to access the audio tab on the control panel and check for your connection via computer or dial-in. Since all attendees are muted, if you have a question or feedback, please enter it in the question box in the control panel on the right of your screen. We will monitor and respond to incoming messages throughout and address some questions as they come up periodically and during the Q&A portion. You may download the Knocking at the College Door report and a packet of profiles for the Midwest from the handouts portion of your control panel. We are recording this webinar and you will receive a message with a link to the presentation slides and recording after the webinar. Lastly, you'll be directed to do a brief evaluation of the webinar when you leave the event. Please take a few minutes to complete that as it helps us to make sure that our resources are useful. As for today's agenda, I will present the high school graduate trends as the first part of the webinar. Then we will hear from our panelists, Eric Litzenberger with the Illinois Board of Higher Education and Olga Volkova with the Indiana Department of Workforce Development about their impressions of these projections and what they mean for the work they do. I would like to preface my presentation about the trends with a few technical notes. We use what is called a cohort survival ratio method to generate the high school graduate projections. We gather the most recently available data from the Federal Common Core of Data for Public School Students, which are 90% of the total, and from the Private School Survey for private religious and non-sectarian school students. For this edition, the 9th, school year 2013 to 14, was the most recent actual data, for the most part, with some variation across public and private school students. We use the student data to compute ratios which show the quantitative patterns of students progressing from grade to grade and on to graduation. And we use the 5 most recent years' patterns to project the number of students and eventually graduates in future years. If we used just student data, we could only project about a decade out. So we add in data about births in recent years to project out further, about 18 years into the future. As for methodology, over the years, the number of U.S.-born kids and how they succeed getting through school has been the primary determinant of the high school graduate trends. We don't explicitly model or quantify many factors that influence how the students progress through school, such as whether they are retained in a grade or promoted early, movement between schools, locales, or states, policy changes, or economic or other environmental factors. These sorts of things are implicit in the enrollment and graduate counts and therefore in the ratios that form the projections. We also can't know exactly the amount that immigration adds to high school graduate numbers, but our analysis indicates it was notable in prior years of high immigration and has reduced recently with declines in immigration. We summarize these and many important details about the underlying data and methodology in Appendix C of the report. On the whole, our analysis indicates that any data or methodology nuances have only marginal effects on the overall trends, if any. However, Please do type any questions you have about data or methodology in the question box, and we will take a look at them later. So let's begin with the national trends for high school graduates. The big national headlines are that despite the recent improvements in the official high school graduation rate, the sheer number of youth is moderating. This leads to a slowdown and even declines in the number of high school graduates, in large part as a result of long-predicted decreases in the number of white youth, which outpace even substantial increases among non-white student populations. On this slide, the two charts illustrate the projected national trends. The chart on the left shows the populations of public school graduates by race ethnicity, plus graduates of private schools, from the first projected year to the last. The top black line shows the total and graduate counts at several points in time over these 18 projected years. The line chart on the right indicates the starting number and year-over-year numeric increase or decrease in each population of graduates over these years, compared to where they were in the last confirmed school year, 2012-13. In total, after almost 2 decades of steady growth in the number of high school graduates, averaging about 2% annually, the nation reached a high of about 3.44 million graduates around 2013. Between now and about 2025, there is virtually no increase projected, except for a few years of small increase around the year 2025, when the nation will produce between 3.5 and 3.6 million high school graduates. After the year 2025, the number of high school graduates nationally is projected to decrease steadily to about 3.3 million, or about 7% fewer by the early 2030s as in recent years. These decreases in the outer years arise from long-predicted contraction of the white youth population and are compounded by dramatic birth declines for all populations during and after the Great Recession. In other words, a recent baby bust over the last 7 to 8 years. Looking at the line chart on the right, white public high school graduates are projected to decrease by 17% by the early 2030s, about 250,000 fewer graduates than in 2013. Barely a decade and a half ago, around 2000, whites represented 70% of all high school graduates. They are projected to be about 52% of public school graduates by the end of the projections. Unforeseen increases in the number of non-white high school graduates could tip the balance to majority-minority within the span of the projections. Hispanic high school graduates, shown here on the green line, are the primary growth population, increasing almost 50% by the year 2025. From 640,000 to almost 900,000. During the growth years, the additional number of Hispanic graduates more than offsets the decline of white high school graduates. But then, even Hispanic graduates are projected to decrease in number between 2025 and the early 2030s as a result of the recent birth declines, which were greatest among Hispanics. Asian Pacific Islander graduates, in the lighter gray line, are the only population projected to increase throughout, but they are only about 5 to 7% of the total number of graduates nationally in any year, so their numbers don't shift the overall trend of decline. Black high school graduates are about 15% of the national total, shown in the gold line, and they will be relatively steady in number throughout the projections, but with some minor decrease. The numbers for American Indian Alaska Native students nationally are very small compared to other student populations, but overall there is some decline. High school graduates from private religious and independent schools are projected to decrease by about 26% by the end of the projections, about 80,000 graduates, in reflection of their largely white student demographic, but also due to significant contraction among religious schools over the last decade or so. The national projections mask significant variation by region and among the states. Here we see the regional differences. On the line chart, the number shown for each region is the region's high point in the number of high school graduates. The map shows WICHE's 4 regional definitions. The South is the engine of growth for high school graduates. By 2025, it will generate about 10% more graduates than in 2013 and is primarily responsible for the growth predicted for the nation around the year 2025. About 45% of the nation's graduates will be from the South region by the early 2030s. The West region overtook the Midwest in terms of number of high school graduates produced by 2010 and now produces about 30% of the nation's high school graduates. The West region has long been the most diverse region. Perhaps the most surprising thing for the Western region is the rapid contraction in high school graduates projected after 2025, which arise from dramatic declines in the number of Hispanic graduates. The Northeast and Midwest regions reached their high points for high school graduates in the school year 2009-10. The number of graduates from these regions have already begun decreasing and will continue to decline throughout the projected years. Now, as we turn to the Midwest region trends, I should mention that WICHE puts North and South Dakota in the West region, not the Midwest, because they are WICHE member states. Therefore, North and South Dakota's graduates are not covered in the overall Midwest regional numbers I will speak to. However, I will quickly preview these states' individual trends also. The Midwest has generated about 765,000 total graduates annually in recent past years. It isn't projected to reach that number again. High school graduates from the Midwest will decrease to around 740,000 on average through the year 2025, and then about 685,000 on average after 2025. Graduating classes in the early 2030s will be about 14% smaller than the number of graduates generated in the class of 2010. There has already been some decrease since 2010, and so they will be about 10% smaller in number around 2030 than they are at about this point in time. On this slide, again, we see the projected relative composition of high school graduates here for the Midwest region. The line chart on the right shows the relative increases or decreases in the number from each population by race ethnicity in the thousands. The Midwest's declines are driven by rapid contraction in the number of white high school graduates, which are projected to be about 16% fewer in number by the early 2030s than now, or about 60,000 fewer white high school graduates from the Midwest over these approximately 15 years. Currently, about a quarter of the Midwest graduates are non-white. They will increase 6% to become 30% of the total by the early 2030s, due to the increased number of Hispanics and Asian graduates at the same time that the number of white high school graduates decrease. There will be rapid increase in the number of Hispanic high school graduates in the Midwest, from about 60,000 in recent years to 95,000 by the time they reach a high point in 2025. An almost 70% increase over about a decade. But the Hispanic youth population in the Midwest and the other non-white populations are just not substantial enough to offset the much larger numeric decreases among the majority white high school graduate population. The Midwest generates more Asian high school graduates in each year through the early 2030s, increasing almost 50% from about 23,000 to 34,000. Black high school graduates were about 90,000 on average in recent years. They are projected to decline about 14% by the early 2030s to around 80,000 per year on average. The Midwest has generated about 4,000 American Indian high school graduates per year on average, about 13% of the national total. Their numbers are projected to decline incrementally throughout the projection, similar to the national trend. And finally, private high school graduates in the Midwest are projected to decrease by more than 25%, from around 65,000 in recent years to about 47,000 by the early 2030s, as a result of enrollment losses between 2000 and 2010 that were almost entirely among Catholic and other religious schools. At this point, we'll take a quick look at each of the states in the Midwest. We don't have the time to go into great detail, but hopefully you'll be able to see some of the differences among the states. And did you know that on our website, www.knocking.wiche.edu, you can browse each state's trends in our online state profile dashboards. You will see the link pop up in your question box on the control panel. Feel free to copy that and browse the state profiles as we go through the webinar. And please use the question box to send us feedback or any questions about what you see with the state trends. So this table on this slide categorizes the Midwest states by relative groupings in terms of their production of graduates overall out through the year 2025, which you'll remember is typically the high point for the foreseeable future. The Midwest's biggest states are in decline, shown on the left. The other states, except for North and South Dakota, will be either pretty much steady state or have only modest, albeit steady, increases in the number of high school grads. Here you can see the individual states. For these next several slides, we have ordered them by the greatest to least number of graduates generated. You see Illinois at the top as a way to explain the several data points that are shown with each state's chart. Number 1, we show the average number of graduates projected per year from the class of 2014 to the class of 2032. And the second data point is by how much non-white graduates will increase as a percent of all graduates. 3 of the top 10 states in the nation, which generate about 55% of the nation's total number of high school graduates, are Midwestern states. Between them, Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio generate about 12% of the nation's graduates and 48% of the Midwest total high school graduates. In recent years, Illinois, at the top, was number 5 nationally, producing about 150,000 graduates per year and about 20% of the Midwest total. Illinois will maintain its 5th position nationally in terms of number of high school graduates, but for the next 8 to 10 years, the number of graduates will gradually decrease to about 4% fewer by around 2025. That will be followed by a decline of another 13%. Due to decreases in the number of both white and non-white graduates. Michigan has produced almost 110,000 graduates in recent past years, but is projected to produce almost 20% fewer high school graduates between now and the early 2030s, driven almost exclusively by declines in white high school graduates. Ohio will experience less dramatic decreases in the number of graduates, but still ends with about 12% fewer graduates in the early 2030s compared to recent years. Non-white graduates in Ohio will increase by about 30%, but not be enough to offset the 20% fewer white graduates. Indiana has some years of increase before experiencing the outer year declines driven by the recent baby bust. Interestingly, Indiana will see robust increases of private school graduates, contrary to the trend elsewhere. The Midwest states shown on this slide are all projected to fare relatively better, with small to moderate increase out through 2025 resulting in new high numbers of graduates. And while the nation and many states end in the early 2030s with fewer graduates than they started, several of these Midwest states end with slight increase in the number of graduates by the early 2030s. Somewhat surprisingly, Missouri is projected to have about 20% more private high school graduates by the early 2030s, contrary to the overriding downward trend for private high school graduates. For the states here, the slight increases in the total number of graduates are almost exclusively due to increases among non-white graduates. Iowa, Kansas, Minnesota, and Nebraska have relatively less steep decrease in the number of white high school graduates than the other Midwest states, even though they also will have fewer graduates by the early 2030s. And finally, our North and South Dakota, which again, we include in the West total numbers because they are witchy states. However, they are shown here for purposes of their lying typically in the Midwestern definition. North Dakota is projected to have rapid increases across the board in each race ethnicity, predicted by the rapid immigration for the oil and gas industry, which could of course change depending on what occurs going forward with that industry. South Dakota's increases come almost entirely from non-white populations. White high school graduate numbers are basically the same over the 15 or so projected years. I will conclude my portion by pointing you to our website again, www.knocking.witchy.edu. There you can obtain a variety of information, including the print report, printable data dashboards, downloadable data in Excel format, and recordings of prior webinars and presentation slides. Before turning this over to our panelists, I'm going to pause for a moment to issue a thought-provoking poll question and see if we have any questions in our queue. You should see our poll question open up. The question is, which trend is most challenging for your work? The increasing number from new student populations, overall reduction of youth and graduates, or something else? If you take a minute to answer that, weigh in, and then using the questions box, type in how these trends have been showing up in your work if you'd like to share that feedback. Okay, at this point, we're almost going to close the poll, and overwhelmingly, from the audience that we have present, it seems that the overall reduction of youth graduates seems to be a predominant impact in your region. We don't have any questions coming in at this point about the data or the trends. So at this point, I would like my panelists to please unmute yourselves from your end, and we will begin hearing from you about how these trends impact your work. Eric and Olga, I'll ask both of you to please take 2 or 3 minutes to describe the organization that you represent and tell us how the trends are relevant in your state or in the work that you do. And so, Eric, I'll turn to you first. If you could take a couple of minutes, explain the work you do and how these trends are showing up for you.
Sure. And I appreciate the opportunity to be able to discuss these important issues today. As previously mentioned, my name is Eric Litzenberger, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly to the audience. I work for the Illinois Board of Higher Education. We're a coordinating board as opposed to a governing board, but nonetheless we have wide-ranging statutory responsibilities. We oversee 12 comprehensive public universities, 96 not-for-profit private institutions, 26 proprietary institutions, and there are also 29 out-of-state schools that have operating authority within the great state of Illinois. However, due to the recent expansion of SARA, the State Authorization and Reciprocity Agreement, we've seen a few of those out-of-state schools relinquish their operating authority and move entirely online, so that's kind of an interesting trend as well. We also work in conjunction with the Illinois Community College Board, and they have purview over 48 community colleges. I think another interesting fact specific to IBHE is that we also oversee the state's private business and vocational school sector, which encompasses 258 individual schools. And those schools tend to have programmatic offerings that range from short-term certificates and things such as dog grooming and massage therapy to longer-term programs and things such as welding and nursing. We currently have a staff of 34, so we have wide-ranging responsibilities with a limited number of staff members, not to complain. I'm the Deputy Director for Information Management and Research, and I also serve as the Illinois Board of Higher Education's Chief Information Officer. I've been at IBHE for roughly a year and a half. Prior to my arrival at IBHE, I worked for a research entity within the state called the Illinois Education Research Council, which was the research arm of the Illinois P20 Council. And there I conducted a series of longitudinal research studies on high school to college transitions as well as college enrollment patterns. And I eventually focused some of my research portfolio on college to workforce transitions. And through my tenure at the Illinois Education Research Council, that the studies tended to evolve. They initially were a little bit more descriptive, and they matured to become a little bit more quasi-experimental in nature. At IBHE, my current responsibilities include managing our component of the Illinois Longitudinal Data System, which we affectionately refer to as the Illinois Higher Ed Information System. Our collection covers the bulk of degree granting institutions operating within the state, and we do have short-term plans to expand the collection this coming year to include enrollment and certification information from the private business and vocational school sector. Granted, we get additional funding to do that. But I guess in terms of the wonderful information that was included in this report, it kind of points to the fact that the main pipeline into most Illinois colleges might be at risk. Illinois is fairly unique in the national scope. We have trouble recruiting students from outside the state to our colleges here. So the main source, the main pipeline of college enrollment are traditional high school graduates who have graduated high school within 12 months and enroll as first-time, full-time freshmen. And coupled with that is the fact that our pipeline tends to be quite leaky into other states, and a lot of the other states that were previously mentioned, particularly Ohio, Iowa, Wisconsin, Indiana, and to a slightly lesser extent Michigan and Missouri, they do a really good job of systematically recruiting our high school graduates, and strategically they're able to capture a fairly high proportion of our best and brightest high school graduates. So our pipeline's kind of leaky, our pipeline's getting smaller, and I think this kind of points at the need to rethink our strategy and perhaps provide a more concerted effort towards focusing a little bit more on non-traditional populations such as adults. I know in the lengthier version of this report, it also included information from the American Community Survey as well as the Lumina Foundation's Stronger Nation report. And I think that information is good information. It provides, as opposed to FLOW, which is the high school pipeline, it provides information on the stock of individuals with degrees within the state. And I think combining the two, the FLOW and the stock, gives us really good information and kind of points to the fact that, you know, perhaps we could strategically think of ways to focus on, I think we have 22% of our working age population who've attended college but lack a degree. I think if we could strategically work with some of our colleges to get those people towards degree completion, it would benefit the Illinois economy as a whole and perhaps make up for that initial leaky part of the pipeline as we're losing students to other states. But that's all I really have to say for now, and I'll yield the control capabilities to my colleague Olga.
Thank you, Eric. Olga, if you would take a couple of minutes, introduce the work that you do and your primary impressions from these data. So I know that, oh, hi Olga. The floor is yours.
Can you guys hear me at this point?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So yes, thank you both. Thank you, Peace, and thank you, Eric. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Olga Volkova, and as I stated earlier, I'm the data team manager over business and workforce studies at the Indiana Department of Workforce Development. First, I kind of just want to go over the mission and vision of DWD, and that is to develop a premier workforce that will allow Indiana employers to flourish and entice businesses from outside our state to relocate to Indiana. So kind of, you know, what Eric had mentioned is that we not only like to steal your students, but we like to steal your businesses as well. Nothing wrong with that, in my opinion, healthy competition. To accomplish this goal, we really focus on several things, one of which is system alignment, a client-centric approach, and working on demand-driven programs and incentives. These initiatives, along with cutting-edge technology, really help us to assess and plan for Indiana's employment future. Some of the work that I do as the data team manager is to really help and partner with our state, local, government, as well as regional and local partners to better understand where are those students that we may be not graduating, as well as, again, keeping a lens on workforce development, why we're not getting individuals into our workforce pipeline, which is critically important. So that's just some of the work that I've been doing. I've been in my position about 2 years, and it's been a challenge, but it's been quite interesting to see how some of the changes and some of the tools that we've built out have really started to align our educational pipeline with our work pipeline. Now I'd like to turn over to the findings in the slides and just kind of talk a little bit about that. So, as the number of high school graduates, both from public and private, continue to decline in the U.S., it presents us at a critical time to ensure that those graduates who are coming out of our K through 12 system are really ready to enter the workforce. Looking at the state-specific profiles, we can see that Indiana does have a slight increase in projections for 2018-2019 for our graduates, but then an overall 1% decline from 2015 to 2025. And looking at that, our main priority, again, is to ensure that those graduates have access to the next steps in their lives, whether that be employment or higher education. There are various programs currently that the department, the agency, has been committed to, such as Jobs for America's Graduates, Work Indiana, CTE, and internships that are making critical impacts on our youth in our state, and I'm happy to go over those a little bit later in some of our other discussions. In Indiana, by offering premier higher education to some of our colleges and universities, we really hope to attract high school students to continue their education, not just from our own state, but also from other states. And we do see that high school students graduating is also in decline in our our surrounding states, but they are still graduating higher numbers. Indiana is one of the lower pure sheer numbers statewide, that we are just not graduating that many actual people. Only 9.7% of the Midwest total, and so our partner states hold a larger share of graduates that may want to make that transition to live and work in our state. Our agency is really concentrated in making partnerships with other agencies and local and state governments that are committed to aligning the needs of our employers with well-skilled and prepared individuals for our workforce. So that's really my focus, which is making sure that the graduates that are coming out of our pipeline really are well prepared to take the jobs of the future. And we've been doing quite a bit of work with our colleges and universities to make sure that there's a really good alignment between the folks that are coming out, as well as the industries that are looking for folks to start working in that particular field. And I will turn it back to you guys at this point.
Thank you, Olga. So as a matter of fact, since I know that you are joining us on the go, so to speak,
Yes.
and I appreciate that, I'm going to actually ask you to continue with what you just sort of mentioned. It was one of the things we wanted to hear more about, is you mentioned that you are working to help tighten up the correspondence between what is being provided in schools and colleges, curriculum, and then credentials on the workforce. Could you give a few examples or sort of highlights of how specifically you're actually using those data, such that if that's an interesting point for folks somewhere else, they could understand how they can reach out to departments such as yours, and what type of information they need to ask for in order to sort of tighten up some of those connections.
Absolutely, yeah, certainly. So the Department of Workforce Development, again, is really committed to addressing these concerns and partnering with applicable individuals and agencies to help promote better alignment of employees and employers. One of our main initiatives is to, again, align CTE education as well as traditional college paths to those employers that are, seeking well-skilled employees. So one of our, give me just one moment, I was going through a little bit of a turn here. So one of the things that we have done is that we have developed a Tableau visual that shows Ivy Technical, that is one of our technical colleges here, graduation data with demand. So we've aligned their actual graduation data with demand data by county for those fit-to-stock occupations to assess where there may be oversaturation or insufficiencies of particular degrees offered and of available jobs. So this really has helped guide colleges, not just Ivy Tech, to get a better understanding of which programs they will need to provide to fill the jobs not only for today, but also projected for those projected 10 years out. So we're combining job posting data, projections data, as well as graduation data from those community colleges to understand where our gaps are. While this is a great start, of course we acknowledge that this is only part of the equation. And so currently we're actually working to incorporate labor force into this visualization, as well as more information from other various colleges and universities around the state, so we can get a really good understanding of where our supply and where our demands are and where those inconsistencies may lie. We're also developing a demand-driven workforce system which outlines the specific skills that employers are seeking and degrees that align with those particular skills. In conjunction with these two tools, they can help guide the youth of our state to make informed decisions regarding education and employment. And just overall, sorry about that. Overall, as I have mentioned, Indiana's top priority really is to make sure we engage, align, and advance our workforce today and for years to come. So we're really hoping that some of these initiatives, as well as just the visualization of the data, hoping that it will spark that interest in people and also that understanding in people to really see that this is something that can be worked on, and we can align some of our folks coming out of the educational sphere with our workforce. And again, we continue to evolve this. It's just a matter of moving it forward as time goes on and as we learn more information.
Thank you for that. So what I'm going to turn this back to Eric now, since I had put him on hold. And Eric, you'll have the floor from this point for the next several minutes until we stop for audience question and answer. If you wouldn't mind sort of responding along the same lines as someone in a position with a wealth of information, if you have some specific ideas or perhaps even just concerns or points about how taking some of this information, which can be striking when seen and visualized, but how can it be used, how can it be disseminated so that folks can tackle the issues at hand and do some planning?
I completely agree with my colleague from Indiana, Olga. I think a great way to do that is data visualization. And you don't necessarily need SaaS business analytics or Microsoft BI. I mean, what we try to do at IBHE is take complex relationships and try to simplify things and then create executive level summaries that would be digestible by policymakers and the general public alike. That's kind of our main goal. And what we're also moving towards right now is we build out our longitudinal data system is to strategically and creatively think of ways that we could enable other people to analyze our data and make sense of it as well. So we're kind of moving towards data visualization and the development of data dashboards so other people could use our data within certain parameters and obviously with access controls implemented. But I think that's a great way. Also, getting the word out and marketing the results of research and just better advertising what data are available from an agency perspective, as well as what data can be available if you think about it more in terms of the P20 spectrum, so how early childhood interacts with K-12, how K-12 interacts with both the community college system and the four-year institutions within the state, both public and private. There are many complex relationships. So, and as Olga was mentioning, I think data visualization, providing access to the information in data dashboards and tools such as those, helps kind of drive that conversation, while also trying to maintain some control and internally here at IBHE, allowing us to get our message across and the word out. And I think taking our internal data and combining it with information such as was produced in this report is kind of the best of both worlds, because a lot of times if you're just dealing with statewide data sets, it's limited to that statewide context. And that's why I like reports such as what was just produced by Witchy, in that I could look and see what's going on in Indiana and Ohio and Michigan and Minnesota, and look at the interaction of what's going on in Illinois related to what's going on there, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
Thank you for that. Those are both sort of broad ideas and strategies, but also some specific examples of how to take this information and hopefully provide it to the right people to make it useful. Eric, I know, in having spoken with you earlier and just in the description of some of the work that you've done over the course of your career, your research on things such as transition points in the education pipeline and community college transfer and credentials of any sort, but sub-associate in particular. Could you talk a little bit about that as part of the solution, possibly, or part of the puzzle at the very least, concerning these converging demographic changes and the labor market demands for increasing education at the same time that our population is changing so swiftly?
I guess first I'll talk to that shrinking pipeline that I mentioned before, that's also quite leaky, and it kind of sounds like a pharmaceutical commercial, and I apologize for that, but Illinois is somewhat notorious for losing high school students to surrounding Midwest states, the states that which you did a really good job of highlighting in this Midwestern report. We looked at Illinois high school graduates from 2013, 14, 15, and honed in on their college enrollment patterns the fall semester immediately after they graduated high school. And what we're finding is that amongst the individuals who enroll at four-year colleges, we're approximating 50% enrollment out of state, which is kind of surprising. I developed some parallel metrics about 4 or 5 years ago that focused on the high school graduating class of 2002, and back then it was only 29%. So in the dozen or so years that have passed, our rate of out-of-state enrollment amongst those enrolling at four-year colleges increased by about 50%, 16 percentage points. So that's problematic from a human capital point of view. I think another issue is that we need to determine whether or not the students who are from Illinois and enroll in college outside of Illinois come back to see if it's actually a true brain drain issue. And when I was at the IERC, we actually conducted research that did just that. And what we found was that of the students from Illinois who graduate at out-of-state institutions, only 2/3 eventually return in are employed in Illinois for at least 1 quarter. If you're from Illinois and you graduate from an Illinois college, your likelihood of working in Illinois and being an Illinois taxpayer is about 95%. So I think using data strategically and showing policymakers and trying to come up with policy solutions to address those issues is important. I think one area where higher education institutions within Illinois perhaps could make some improvement is the fact that our tuition tends to be somewhat higher than the tuition in neighboring states. And to a certain extent, it's artificially higher because in the state of Illinois we have truth in tuition policy, where tuition gets set for 4, 5, sometimes 6 years based on what you're paying your freshman year. So when parents and students are looking at the sticker price for college, ours seems artificially higher, and it tends to be kind of higher to begin with. So I think exposing things like that and providing good, solid information to policymakers, along with contextual information that provides parallel information from other states, is highly valuable from a policymaker point of view. And I'm not quite sure if I answered your question, and if I didn't, can you just reiterate it?
No, that was. Thank you. Thank you for taking a stab at that. Hard to get to cover everything, and so those were really relevant and helpful points. What I'm going to do at this point is we had just a couple of questions come in from the audience, so I'm going to turn to them. One of our questions, in fact, was for you, Eric, so I'll get to that after I answer a couple of more technical ones. So the first question that we had was coming from someone in Wisconsin, saying that they had been hearing from their system in institutions that there had been recent declines in the state in the number of high school graduates, and that our data seem to confirm that. Indeed, that is what is being seen in the data. And so if something of those of you out in Wisconsin, you find it surprising to see that trend as we've presented it here, or maybe you were surprised to hear of it from your colleagues, it's confirmed in the data, and that by virtue of the way we make these projections, based on, for example, the first 3 to 4 years worth of the projections are based on the high school not high school graduate, but high school enrollment population. So short of strong increases in the high school graduate population in very short order, then the trends as they are seen in the short term at least are unlikely to be any different than what we presented here. And it is sometimes striking to actually see that for the first time. And hopefully being able to see some of this information is useful. You can take it to your colleagues and say, this gives us a little bit of a lens into the next 5 to 10 years. If there's something about it that we should be taking notice, then here's some information about that. The other question from Wisconsin, it applies not just to Wisconsin, but across the board, is the question of homeschooled students and high school graduates. To the extent that a homeschooled student receives a diploma in their state, they are counted in the graduates. We do not have the data to disaggregate those student populations from the overall total, but they would be counted in the public high school graduates to the extent that they actually were awarded a diploma. And to my knowledge, it's a rare thing that they wouldn't actually be counted in the graduate trends. Unfortunately, by not being able to disaggregate them, I can't tell you too much about increase in the homeschool population more than what you could find at the national level from some reports, which is there has been small increase, but it remains 3 to 4% of the public school total. Another question that was a little bit more, if you will, technical before turning it back to some questions that we had for the panelists is, do we have projections for changes in the proportion of high school graduates that are going on to 2- or 4-year institutions? Short answer is we do not produce projections about what will happen with high school graduates and their enrollment or entry into the labor force past high school graduation. Of course, you can find some of that information from the National Center for Education Statistics or the federal data available about this, and that includes projections that are issued yearly in what's called Projection of Education Statistics. That's very high-level data, of course. Some states may you may be able to inquire with state departments of higher education or education for their, potentially they do research on this topic. All of that being said, that we do not have specific places to point you to more quantifiable information about what will happen with the trends of enrollment in 2 versus 4-year institutions. It is the case that historically and currently the growing proportion of the graduates who are not non-white or minority graduates, their trend or their tendency is to enroll in a 2-year institution. So in order to that, ergo the growing population of high school graduates that are minority, one, all things being equal as they are at this point in time, one would expect the number of individuals seeking a 2-year education would grow. However, that is our opportunity for investigating what can be done to increase perhaps pursuit and success with a 4-year institution by this growing non-white population. So Eric, perhaps I don't know if you're in front of your screen, so I'll read this question because we had questions for you that followed from your comments. The first one, you mentioned the increase of out-of-state enrollment, I believe, in the 4-year institutions, and so there's perhaps both an interesting, perhaps a little provocative question if the increase you think is due to recent instability of funding for higher education in Illinois. And just some general interest about how you think the budget impasse would potentially impact college enrollment in the short, potentially longer term future.
Oh, I might partially punt on that question. We're attempting to answer that right now. We've built a model to predict what things should have been prior to our budget impasse, and we're in the process of working with our colleagues at the Illinois State Board of Education, which oversees K-12, to obtain more recent information. So we're going to focus on the high school graduates from 2016 as they matriculated to college this past fall semester, and that data should become available to us maybe within a month. So we're assuming in early summer we would be better able to address that question. I guess I'm comfortable saying it probably hasn't helped, and my assumption is that it'll probably move us closer to that 50% threshold, where 50% of the Illinois high school graduates who enroll at 4-year colleges are enrolling outside the state. So far, we've actually experienced an increase in enrollment, and this is just looking at 2014 to 2015. It was actually a proportional increase and an increase in actual numbers, and that occurred even with a slight decline in the number of high school graduates. So I guess in looking at this issue, it's good to work with your K-12 partners and take a more P20 spectrum approach, and use your own information from your state in conjunction with these outside data sources, such as information produced by WICHE and CES, as well as Lumina's Stronger Nation report.
Great, and thank you for that last comment, because that allows me to reiterate to folks that to the extent that we could, we attempted to supplement projections, which are limited to the high school graduate population, with other information on the state profile and on our website. We are only about 3 months from the release of these projections, and we are currently in the process of planning additional supplements, if not projections per se, but additional information exploring sort of the geographic distribution across urban and rural areas, differences by student sex, that is female or male differences in graduation, and some other sorts of things. So stay tuned on our by making sure you've signed up on the website to receive further emails about things that come forth, and also please take a look at the data dashboards that are on the website, because we provided information that is not projections, but at this point in time some information about differences by student demographic in their sort of educational performance, in adult educational attainment by state, income for families with children present, and some other sorts of things. So we hope that you'll find that useful. We've had a couple of questions about other types of projections, particularly those that extend into college-going projections, and I We will be following this webinar with an email pointing you to the recording of the webinar and the webinar or the presentation slides on our website. When we send that email, you can access the presentation slides, and we will add links to other sources of projection information since we can't fully cover that here. At this point, we don't have any further questions, so what I am going to do is just take a minute to wrap it up because we're close to time, and I'd like to sincerely thank our panelists for joining us, taking their time and giving us a few insights about the Midwestern trends and the impact of these trends. I'd also, again, like to thank everybody who attended this webinar, and since the recording is available after we finished, I hope that you will bring it forth to your colleagues, and if there is something here that is useful for your planning or your knowledge, that you could move that out to the constituency that you work with. I'll leave the webinar open for about 5 minutes to receive any more questions through the question box, and if we didn't get to you during this webinar, then we will email with you with a response afterwards. You can sign up for email notifications about forthcoming products that we are producing related to this work at www.knocking.witchy.edu. So I'd like to thank our panelists and the audience and say have a great afternoon. Thank you for attending, and please complete the evaluation as you exit.